The rolling hills of the countryside stretched endlessly before me, bathed in the warm light of a setting sun that made everything appear peaceful and serene. The scent of pine trees and the soft rustle of the leaves in the breeze whispered promises of a quiet life, far away from the bustle of city noise. I had dreamed of this moment for years, the chance to escape from the chaos of urban living and settle into a haven where I could breathe freely. I had spent countless hours searching for the perfect property, one that matched my vision of tranquility, and when I found the ranch, it seemed like destiny had finally smiled upon me. I had barely unpacked my bags when I stood by the front gate of the property, soaking in the beauty of my new home. The ranch was isolated enough to feel like a true retreat, with acres of land, grazing horses, and the occasional deer wandering through the nearby woods. The front gate was a classic wooden structure, tall enough to offer a sense of privacy, but not imposing. It was exactly what I had wanted. Little did I know that very gate would become the focal point of a battle that would take away my peace of mind. It all started on an ordinary Tuesday morning when the mail arrived. I was sipping coffee, enjoying the early sunshine, when I noticed the envelope. It was from the HOA, a letter with no return address, only a small logo that made my stomach tighten. I had heard about homeowners associations and their sometimes excessive rules, but I never thought I'd actually have to deal with one. I opened the letter with curiosity, wondering what they could possibly want from someone living on a large rural property. The letter was direct and to the point. We have noted a violation of the community guidelines regarding the height of your front gate. As per Section 5, Subsection 2 of the HOA manual, gates are not permitted to exceed 6 feet in height. Your gate is approximately 7 feet. We ask that you rectify this matter within 10 days to avoid further action. I reread the letter several times, trying to make sense of it. 7 feet. The gate, in my eyes, was perfect. It wasn't overly tall, nor was it imposing. It was a simple wooden gate that fit the natural aesthetics of the ranch. How could such a minor issue be a violation? Still, I was new to the area and perhaps I was missing something. I decided to call the HOA office to get clarification. When I called, the voice on the other end was polite but distant. The person who answered explained the issue quickly and coldly. The gate exceeded the height limit outlined in the community guidelines, and there was no room for flexibility. I tried to explain that the gate was an integral part of the design of the property, blending in with the natural surroundings. But the response was robotic, a refusal to listen to reason. Sorry, but the rules are clear, she said. If you don't comply within the stipulated time frame, we will have to fine you. I felt the frustration building within me. This was ridiculous. I had only just arrived, and now I was already being penalized for something as trivial as the height of a gate. I asked if there was any possibility of a compromise, perhaps lowering the gate slightly or discussing it further in person. Again, I was met with the same response. The rules were the rules, and the HOA wouldn't budge. It wasn't the response I had hoped for, but I wasn't ready to back down. I decided to take a more formal approach. I sent an email outlining my concerns and asking for clarification on the reasoning behind the height restriction. I suggested that perhaps the rule could be reconsidered in light of the uniqueness of the property and the natural landscape. The reply came a day later, terse and dismissive. They had already made their decision, and they were not willing to engage in further discussion. The email ended with the threat of legal action if the issue wasn't resolved. At this point, I began to feel the growing frustration of being trapped in an unjust situation. How had it come to this? A small mistake in height was turning into an ordeal. I hadn't even had the chance to truly enjoy my new home, and now I was already facing the wrath of an institution I barely understood. The days passed, and I continued to try and reason with them, sending more emails, making more calls. Every attempt to discuss the issue was met with indifference. The HOA seemed to thrive on its rules and regulations, refusing to see any gray area or room for compromise. It became clear that they weren't interested in resolving the matter in a fair or balanced way. They were more interested in asserting their control over the community, and I was simply the next person to feel the weight of their authority. Then the fines started. First a small one, then another and another. Each letter I received was a reminder of my growing helplessness. They weren't even giving me the chance to rectify the situation. They were simply penalizing me for my refusal to comply with their unreasonable demands. I had followed the process, tried to be patient, and yet all I faced was an unyielding force determined to squeeze every penny out of me. Each fine made the situation more infuriating. What began as a simple request to lower the gate had morphed into a battle of principle. They weren't going to win. Not like this, but the more I thought about it, the more I realized something. It wasn't really about the gate. It was about the principle of it all. The HOA wasn't looking for a solution or compromise. They wanted control, and I had become their target. They saw a new resident, someone who might be easily intimidated or swayed by their rules, and they pounced. The tension in me grew, but I still hadn't fully grasped the enormity of what I was about to face. I hadn't yet realized the depth of the battle I had unwittingly stepped into. The small disputes over the gate were merely a symptom of something much larger, a bureaucracy, an unwieldy system that was more concerned with enforcing its power than with fostering a sense of community. And I was about to discover just how far they would go to assert that power. By the end of the week, the HOA had taken its stance. They weren't going to back down. I was left with a choice: comply or resist. But as I walked around my property, looking at the very gate they wanted to tear down, I made a decision. This wasn't just about a gate. This was about my right to live freely on my land, and I wasn't going to let anyone, not even the HOA, take that away from me. In that moment, I knew that the battle was only just beginning. The days that followed my frustrating encounter with the HOA felt like a blur. The daily barrage of fines, their dismissive responses to my every attempt at dialogue, had hardened my resolve. I knew that I could no longer rely on conventional methods to fight back. Negotiation, compromise, patience, none of those had gotten me anywhere. The only way to truly win, I realized, was to challenge the very system that had tried to break me. I spent countless hours researching the HOA and its governing structure. I'd never been particularly interested in the inner workings of such an organization before, but now, with everything on the line, I felt driven to learn more. I pored over community documents, combed through local regulations, and scoured the online forums of the HOA's own website. It wasn't long before I uncovered something that made my heart race with both disbelief and excitement. In the fine print of the HOA's bylaws, buried beneath pages of jargon and outdated rules, I found a clause I had missed before, a loophole. This clause gave property owners the right to buy into the HOA's landscape management program, thus gaining control over the entire association's budget and operations. Essentially, I could purchase the land that was managed by the HOA and gain voting power over how the HOA operated. It was a legal path to seize control, and once I grasped the full potential of what this meant, I knew exactly what I had to do. The idea of buying the HOA's entire landscape might have seemed absurd to anyone else, but to me, it was the perfect opportunity to turn the tables. I had no interest in the physical land itself. It was the authority that came with it that mattered. With that power, I would be able to make changes, take back control, and force the HOA to back off. More importantly, I would be able to shift the balance of power, something that had never been done before in this tight-knit community. I went to the local bank and, after presenting my case, secured the funds needed to purchase the landscape. It wasn't easy, and there were countless forms and applications to fill out, but I wasn't going to let anything stop me. I had the vision, and nothing was going to deter me from executing my plan. The transaction went through, and I was officially the proud owner of the HOA's landscape, and, more importantly, a member of the HOA's governing body. I was now in a position to make decisions that affected the entire community. The first decision I made was a bold one. I raised the HOA dues 3 times the previous amount. It wasn't a small increase. It was a dramatic change that would send ripples through the entire neighborhood. I knew this move would send shockwaves through the community, and I was prepared for the fallout. But in that moment, I felt a sense of justice, a feeling of control that I had never experienced before. For the first time, the tables had turned. I spent the next few weeks watching as the news of the increased dues spread like wildfire. Some residents were outraged. Those who were already struggling financially questioned how they would afford the new fees, while others, who had been in the community for years, felt betrayed. The HOA had always been a relatively small organization, and now, with the dues tripled, many felt as though their sense of stability had been ripped away. Yet there were others who were quietly supportive. A small group of residents, frustrated by the HOA's rigidity and overreach, saw my move as a necessary shakeup. They had long been dissatisfied with the way things had been run, and they were relieved to finally see someone take a stand for them. My bold move wasn't just about the dues. It was about taking control away from an institution that had made them feel powerless. The community became divided. The HOA, that had once been a symbol of authority, now seemed out of touch, its members unable to fully grasp the implications of my actions. As more residents spoke out, the air was thick with tension. Some supported me and saw me as a hero, someone who had stood up for the little guy and forced the HOA to face the consequences of its overreach. Others, however, saw me as a villain, someone who had disrupted their lives for no good reason, someone who had made things worse for the very people I had promised to protect. I knew that my decision would have consequences, but I also knew that it had to be done. The HOA's oppressive rules had to be challenged, and if no one else would do it, I would. The newfound power I held over the HOA wasn't something I took lightly. I knew I needed to make the most of this opportunity, and while I relished in the feeling of control, I also understood that I was now a symbol of change, for better or worse. One evening I sat down at my kitchen table, a stack of letters in front of me. Some were from supporters, others from angry residents demanding answers. The letters reflected the divide that had sprung up within the community. The HOA had always prided itself on maintaining a sense of order, of uniformity, but my actions had shown them just how fragile that control really was. The doorbell rang, and I knew who it was before I even opened it. 2 of my neighbors stood. On my doorstep, their faces grim. They were among those who had been hardest hit by the dues increase, and they weren't happy. "We need to talk," one of them, a middle-aged man named Greg, said, his tone sharp. "You've made a huge mistake. You've ruined everything." I invited them inside, but I wasn't sure how the conversation would go. My actions had certainly caused a stir, but I wasn't about to back down. We sat down, and Greg wasted no time in voicing his frustrations. "You don't understand," he said, his voice rising. "You've just made it harder for people like me. I've got kids in school, a mortgage to pay, and now you want to raise the dues? You think that's fair?" I felt the weight of his words, but I wasn't going to back down. "I understand better than you think. The HOA was never about fairness. It was about control. It's about keeping everyone in line, following the same rules, even when those rules are completely out of touch with reality." Greg shook his head. "This isn't the way to fix it. You're just making things worse." I stood my ground. "Maybe it is, but sometimes things have to get worse before they can get better." As the conversation continued, it became clear that the community was torn. Some residents agreed with me while others felt betrayed. The stakes were high and the fallout was just beginning. I had become both a hero and a villain, a figure of power who had disrupted the status quo, and in doing so had caused ripples that would take years to settle. But despite the uncertainty and the anger that filled the air, I couldn't help but feel a sense of satisfaction. I had taken control, and no matter what happened next, the HOA would never be the same again. The weeks following the dramatic increase in HOA dues were nothing short of tumultuous. What I had anticipated to be a temporary shock to the system had escalated into something much bigger. The community, once peaceful and cohesive, had become a battleground for different ideologies, and I was at the center of it all. The increased dues had rippled through the neighborhood, shaking the foundations of trust that had previously held the HOA together. Some residents were livid, while others were grateful for the opportunity to speak out against what they had long perceived as an overbearing system. The first sign that things were beginning to shift came when I started receiving more letters. Some were angry, filled with accusations and frustration. Others were supportive, applauding my bold move to disrupt the status quo. But it wasn't just letters. There were whispers at the local market, in the coffee shop, and even at the community park. The new dues had divided the residents, some seeing it as a necessary evil, a price to pay for the possibility of change, while others felt blindsided and betrayed. They had trusted the HOA to maintain order and fairness, and now they were questioning everything they had known. One evening, as I sat in my living room, going through the latest batch of correspondence, my phone rang. It was from Greg, the neighbor I had spoken to earlier in the week. His voice was calmer now, though there was still an underlying frustration. "We need to talk," Greg said. "There's going to be a community meeting. Everyone wants to have their say, and you need to be there. The residents want a resolution." I hesitated. The thought of facing the entire community after everything that had happened filled me with a sense of dread. I knew that I had caused a stir, but I hadn't expected this level of opposition. Yet, as much as I wanted to avoid it, I knew this was my opportunity, the chance to bridge the gap between the different factions of the neighborhood and find a solution that could bring harmony. "I'll be there," I said, trying to sound confident. The meeting was scheduled for the following weekend, and as the day approached, I couldn't shake the feeling of unease. I wasn't sure what I was walking into, but I knew that the stakes were higher than ever. The community was divided, and I was the one who had set the wheels of change in motion. This meeting would be the moment of reckoning, the moment where I would have to confront my neighbors face to face and negotiate a way forward. When I arrived at the community hall that Saturday, I was greeted by a crowd of residents, their faces a mixture of apprehension, curiosity, and, for some, outright hostility. The room was filled with murmurs and hushed conversations. It felt as though the very air was thick with tension. I took a seat near the front, trying to blend in, but it was impossible to ignore the fact that all eyes were on me. Some people had been supportive of my actions, but others felt as though I had overstepped my bounds. This meeting would be a reckoning, a test of my ability to navigate the delicate balance between change and stability. The meeting began with a few opening remarks from the HOA's board members, but it was clear that the real focus would be on the dues increase. The room quickly became divided, with people either voicing their outrage at the price hike or expressing their belief that it was a necessary step to bring about long-needed reforms. The tension was palpable, and I could feel the weight of every word that was spoken. Greg stood up first, his voice loud and firm as he addressed the room. "We were told that this was about fairness, about bringing change to the HOA's outdated system. But now people are struggling to pay these ridiculous dues. We can't afford this. We're being forced to pay for something we didn't even ask for. This is not what we signed up for when we moved here." His words hit hard, and I could see the frustration on the faces of many in the room. They had trusted the HOA to manage things in a way that was fair and reasonable, and now they were questioning whether that trust had been misplaced. I could feel my heart rate increase, but I knew I had to stand my ground. It wasn't just about defending the dues increase. It was about explaining why I had made this decision in the first place. "I understand your frustration," I said, standing up and addressing the room. Believe me, this wasn't an easy decision, but when I looked at the way the HOA was being run, I saw a system that was more concerned with maintaining control than with listening to the needs of the community. For too long, the HOA has dictated what we can and can't do with our own properties. The increase in dues wasn't about punishing anyone. It was about breaking free from that control. A murmur rippled through the room, and I could sense that my words were striking a chord with some people. But it wasn't enough. I needed to do more than just explain myself. I had to show them that there was a way forward, a way to balance freedom with responsibility, a way to make the HOA work for everyone, not just a select few. "I'm not here to make your lives harder," I continued. "I'm here because I believe we can do better. The HOA should be a force for good in this community, but it's been overbearing for too long. We need to find a way to make the dues more manageable, while still ensuring that the neighborhood is maintained and that everyone has a say in how things are run." I could see some heads nodding in agreement, but others were still skeptical. It was clear that I needed to offer a concrete solution, something that would show them that I wasn't just another voice calling for change without offering a plan. "I propose this," I said, my voice steady. "Let's revisit the dues structure. I'll work with the board and the community to come up with a new plan, one that balances the needs of the community with the financial realities we all face. We can still fund the necessary upkeep of the neighborhood without forcing people to choose between their homes and their livelihoods. And I'll take a step back from this process. I'm not here to be the sole decision-maker. This should be a community effort, and I want to be part of that process, but not in a way that undermines your voices." There was silence in the room for a moment as the weight of my words sank in. Finally, someone from the back of the room stood up. It was Linda, a long-time resident who had always been outspoken about the HOA's practices. She was known for her no-nonsense attitude and had often clashed with the board in the past. "I think you're onto something," she said, her voice firm but not unkind. "This is what we need, a fair balance. We want to live our lives, but we also want to ensure that the neighborhood is well kept. We just need a plan that works for everyone." The room seemed to soften at her words, and for the first time I could sense a shift in the atmosphere. The walls of division were beginning to crumble. People were no longer seeing me as the person who had imposed the dues increase. They were beginning to see me as someone who had the potential to bring about real change. The rest of the meeting went on for several more hours, but the tone had shifted. We discussed different options, from lowering the dues to creating a more flexible payment plan. By the end of the meeting, we had reached a consensus. The new dues would be reduced, and there would be a tiered system based on income, ensuring that those who could afford it would pay more, while those with financial difficulties would not be burdened by the increase. The board would also be restructured to include more community representation, giving residents a more direct voice in how decisions were made. It wasn't perfect, but it was a start, a fair compromise that allowed both sides to feel heard. As the meeting adjourned and people began to filter out of the hall, I felt a weight lift off my shoulders. I had done it. I had taken a system built on overreach and transformed it into something that worked for everyone. I wasn't just a disruptor. I was a leader, someone who had outsmarted the old system and brought about real change. The road ahead wouldn't be without its challenges, but for the first time in a long while, I felt hopeful. The HOA was no longer a symbol of oppressive control. It had become a tool for positive change. And I, with the support of the community, had played a part in shaping that future. As I walked home that evening, the sun setting behind me, I realized that sometimes, in order to create something better, you have to break down the walls that were built to keep you in. I had taken a risk, but it had paid off. The neighborhood was now mine in a way that I had never expected, not because of force, but because I had seen an opportunity and had the courage to take it. And in the end, The real victory wasn't about raising dues or buying power. It was about bringing the community together and giving everyone a voice. The journey wasn't over, but it had only just begun. Subscribe to the HOA Stories for more incredible tales of community battles and the fight for change.